Welcome to Dear Fans. Karoline Leavitt had stood in this chamber before, but today was different. Today, she wasn't just a congresswoman, she was an interrogator of force pressing against the cracks of a system that had long resisted scrutiny. Across from her sat Director Margaret Holloway, the woman responsible for the Federal Bureau of Prisons. Holloway, polished and composed, had built a career on bureaucratic maneuvering, on the art of saying much without saying anything at all. But the weight of today's hearing was different. This wasn't just another discussion on policy, it was an autopsy of a decision that had released 30,000 inmates back into society, a decision whose consequences no one seemed willing or able to quantify. The chamber was stifling in its silence. The heavy wood paneling absorbed every breath, every shifting movement, every quiet scratch of a pen. Cameras loomed at the edges, capturing the tension, transmitting it beyond these walls to an audience that had grown tired of being told to trust. The First Step Act had been a promise, a carefully crafted assurance that justice and rehabilitation could coexist, and yet 6 years later the simple question remained unanswered. Had it worked? Had those who were given a second chance proven worthy of it? Or had the system, blinded by good intentions, unleashed something worse? Leavitt sat motionless, her hands resting lightly on the table, but there was an energy beneath her stillness, a sense of something coiled and waiting. She had spent nights preparing for this, combing through documents, looking for numbers that should have been easy to find but instead led to dead ends and contradictions. She had read statements from victims who had learned their attackers' release only after another crime had been committed. She had seen the faces of families who had been promised reform but given nothing but uncertainty. Margaret Holloway, in her pressed navy suit, sat poised, but there was something in her shoulders, just the slightest tension, the barest hint of awareness that this was not going to be another routine hearing. She had been through these before, knew how to navigate the language of deflection, but this time there was no room to hide behind process and protocol. Leavitt inhaled slowly. The chair beside her creaked as another senator adjusted, but no one spoke. No one dared to break the moment before it began. She let the silence settle. Then finally, she leaned forward, her voice calm, measured, and absolute. How many of them reoffended? Margaret Holloway hesitated, and in that hesitation the battle had already begun. Margaret Holloway had prepared for this. She had rehearsed the questions in her mind, run through every possible answer with her aides, refined each word until it was polished enough to deflect scrutiny. But now, with Karoline Leavitt's gaze locked onto hers, with the air in the chamber still and waiting, none of those rehearsed answers seemed sufficient. She shifted slightly in her chair, a movement so small it could have gone unnoticed, but Leavitt saw it. She saw the way Holloway's fingers curled tighter around the edges of her binder, the way her shoulders held just a fraction too much tension. The director was calculating, searching for a way to answer without truly answering, but the silence stretched, demanding something real. Leavitt didn't move. She had spent enough time in Washington to recognize the patterns, the bureaucratic tap dance designed to stall, to bury the truth beneath layers of technicalities. But today, she wasn't here for that. She wasn't here to listen to another round of vague assurances. She was here for numbers. Holloway finally exhaled. We are still in the process of analyzing. Litt's expression didn't change. She didn't interrupt. She simply waited, letting the weight of the moment press harder. Holloway stopped. She knew it was useless. Leavitt leaned forward, slightly resting her elbows on the table. 30,000. Her voice was quiet but firm. That's how many inmates were released under the First Step Act. The American people were told this was a reform. They were told it was about second chances. So I'll ask again, how many of them reoffended? Holloway's lips pressed together. There was no way out of this without consequence. If she admitted she didn't have the number, it would confirm the worst fears that the government had set these policies in motion without tracking their outcomes. If she had the number, and it was bad, it would be a disaster. If she had it, and it was good, she would have said it already. The realization was settling into the room, the silence, deep, and the kind that made people uneasy, because it wasn't natural. It wasn't the lull of conversation or the pause of thought. It was a void, of vacuum that exposed too much. Litt's fingers tapped lightly against the table, a slow, steady rhythm. Holloway's jaw tightened. 6 years, that's how long it had been since the First Step Act passed. 6 years of releases, of reintegration programs, of assurances from policymakers that this was the right path forward. And yet, sitting here in the very room where those assurances had been made, the woman responsible for overseeing it all had nothing to offer. Olay adjusted in her seat again. The cameras caught it. Leavitt let the seconds stretch, let the moment settle into the minds of every person in the room. A hearing like this wasn't just about Policy, it was about trust the American. People had trusted the government when they were told this law would make things better, safer, fairer, and now with all the time that had passed the government couldn't or wouldn't say whether that trust had been justified. Leavitt finally leaned back, the chair creaked slightly, but her voice remained controlled. You had 6 years. Holloway swallowed. 40,000 employees, Leavitt continued, voice calm, even, and no one can count. Holloway opened her mouth, but nothing came. The reporters in the gallery were motionless, pens hovering over notebooks. They had covered hundreds of hearings before, listened to countless testimonies, but this wasn't just another statement from another official. This was an admission, unspoken but undeniable. No one knew the answer, or worse, they did, and they weren't willing to say it. Leavitt inhaled, slowly exhaled, just as deliberately. This wasn't about catching one bureaucrat off guard. This was about the system itself, about the rot beneath the surface, the kind that wasn't obvious until moments like this exposed it. Under the bright glare of the Senate chamber's lights, she studied Holloway for a moment longer. Then she spoke, her voice quiet but firm. This is why people don't trust government. Holloway didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. The damage had already been done. The chamber felt heavier now, the weight of unspoken truths, of exposed incompetence pressed down on every person in the room. The air was thick with something more than silence, something raw, something close to dread. No one shifted, no one cleared their throat or rustled their papers. Even the low hum of cameras seemed distant, drowned out by the simple fact that Margaret Holloway had no answer. Karoline Leavitt didn't move. She had expected resistance, misdirection, but not this vast empty space where certainty should have been a question so fundamental it should have been stamped on the first page of every report. Yet here sat the woman in charge, unable to say a single number. It wasn't just negligence, it was something worse. She let the moment stretch. There was no rush. The damage was unfolding on its own, sinking deeper with every second that passed. Holloway swallowed. She was still holding on to the pretense of composure, still gripping the edges of her binder, as if the answer could somehow be forced onto the blank pages inside. But her shoulders betrayed her, the way they stiffened, the way her eyes darted not toward Leavitt, but toward the aides behind her, toward the senators, watching toward the exits. She wanted to leave. Leavitt watched her carefully. She had seen this before, the slow unraveling of someone who realized too late that the shield they had built around themselves was gone. Holloway had walked in here expecting to control the narrative, to dictate what was said, what was heard, but the narrative had slipped from her grasp, and now it belonged to Leavitt. The congresswoman leaned forward again, just enough to make Holloway feel it. If you don't know, she said, voice low, steady. Then, who does, parted her lips slightly, then closed them. A muscle in her jaw twitched. Leavitt didn't look away. She let Holloway sit in the silence, let her feel the weight of it, the crushing inevitability that this moment would follow her beyond these walls. There was no saving it now. A chair creaked somewhere in the back. The sound was small but jarring, like the first crack in an otherwise unbroken sheet of glass. One of the aides, a young man in a dark suit, shifted his weight uneasily. He was gripping a notepad, but his pen wasn't moving. He had stopped taking notes minutes ago. There was nothing left to record but the failure itself. Holloway took a slow breath, as if steadying herself, then exhaled through her nose. She tried to reclaim something, some shred of authority, but it was gone. Leavitt tilted her head slightly, studying her. 30,000 released. The words came slow, deliberate. And you don't know how many reoffended. Holloway clenched her hands in her lap, the tension now visible in every inch of her posture. Her silence was the answer. Leavitt let the room absorb it. It would be on every screen by nightfall. Clips of this hearing would play on the news, on phones, on televisions, in living rooms where families had spent years wondering if their government had made them safer or put them at risk, and now they would know the truth. No one had been keeping track. Leavitt straightened, finally, allowing herself to breathe. It wasn't satisfaction. There was nothing satisfying about proving that a system had failed, but there was something necessary about it. A wound had to be exposed before it could be treated. The chairman cleared his throat, the first sound of movement from the front of the room in what felt like hours, a signal that time was up. Leavitt nodded, slow and deliberate. That will be all. Holloway didn't respond. She simply sat there, rigid, as the chamber began to stir around her. But even as the papers shuffled and voices murmured, even as the official proceedings moved forward, the weight of the moment remained. Leavitt stood, gathering her notes. She didn't need them anymore. The real statement had already been made. As she turned to leave, she cast one last glance back at Holloway, still seated at the table, her grip still tight around that useless binder. She looked small now, smaller than when she had first entered the room. The cameras were still rolling, the country was still watching, and somewhere beyond these walls, beyond the polished desks and the cold marble of the Capitol, 30,000 people walked free, and no one knew what they had done since Karoline Leavitt stepped into the corridor, the air outside the chamber thick with the quiet chaos that followed hearings like these. Reporters clustered near the entrance, cameras shifted, aides whispered to their bosses, but no one called out to her, not. Yet the moment was still settling. The weight of what had just happened still hung in the air, waiting to be fully realized. She kept walking inside. Margaret Holloway remained seated, staring at the polished wood of the table in front of her. Her career would not end today. Bureaucracy didn't work that way, but this moment would stain in her. It would stain the entire bureau. Leavitt had seen it before. She had sat in hearings where officials stumbled, where incompetence was revealed in real time, but there was something different about this one. This wasn't just another agency failing to meet expectations. This was something deeper, a system that had released 30,000 inmates, and no one had counted what happened next. She reached the end of the hall, the heavy doors opening into the bright white marble of the Capitol, the heat from outside pressed against the glass, a stark contrast to the cold, calculated world inside. She had expected to feel something as she walked away, victory, maybe a sense of accomplishment. She didn't. Because there was no victory here, there was only the knowledge that she had asked the right question and had been given no answer, that the government had made a promise and had failed to measure whether it had kept it, that somewhere in cities and towns across the country people had been asked to trust in a system that didn't even trust itself enough to check its own results. This wasn't just about Margaret Holloway. It wasn't just about the Bureau of Prisons. It was about every official, every policy maker, every architect of reform who had insisted that this law would work. Some of them had meant well. Some of them had simply wanted the political win, but none of that mattered now. What mattered was the fact that no one, not the people who wrote the law, not the people who enforced it, could tell her, or the American people, if it had made their lives safer. She slowed her steps, her gaze shifting to the towering white columns outside. Trust in government had been fading for years. That wasn't new, but this was why. The failure wasn't just in the policy, it was in the arrogance of those who had assumed it would work without proving it. She exhaled, then continued walking. The news would spread, the footage would play on screens across the country. People would see it, some would dismiss it, some would be outraged, some would defend the policy, insist that reform was still necessary, that this was only a logistical oversight, nothing more. Leavitt wasn't interested in any of that. She had come here for one thing, accountability, and today she had exposed the fact that there was none. Like this video and subscribe this channel. Thank you.